Hey, welcome back. Today I got something a little different because instead of building something, we're gonna be restoring this huge vase. Alright, I'm just messing with you. It's this one. Actually, I just fooled you twice. The thing is that I somehow came into possession of not one, but two rusty old plus-sized vises, and today we're gonna restore one of them, and then there will be a second video on the slightly bigger one you see in front here. The reason I even have these is I was buying a bunch of gears from some guy online for a different project, and he also offered me these vises that had been sitting in his barn for over 30 years for an extremely good price, so naturally I couldn't say no to that, even though I don't really need either of them. The first vise also came with this base plate and a locking screw, because it's a swivel vise that locks from the bottom, which I don't think I've seen before. First thing I had to do was to even get this up on the workbench, because I had the vises stored on the ground and both of them are too heavy for me to lift up there safely. So I'm setting up the old engine hoist here, and this is actually a pretty good opportunity to weigh them. People always ask how heavy things are, and I was a bit curious myself. This one comes in at almost exactly 49 kilos, that's about 110 pounds for the Americans, and I think together with the base plate it's well over 50 kilos. To give you a better sense of the size of these things, here's a banana for scale, or again the hobby-sized vise you saw earlier, which is actually the first vise I ever bought from my workshop. So the previous owner told me these had been sitting unused in the back of a barn for a long time, which means they weren't directly affected by rain, and thanks to that they're mechanically in pretty good shape, despite how aged they look. However, the paint is pretty much falling off by itself, and there's a lot of rust and dirt, and I think they deserve some attention. So now that I've eaten my measuring instrument, let's get to work. The moving jaw on this vise doesn't have a removable back, so in order to remove the jaw you have to first push out the nut from the inside, which slides on dovetails, and pull it out through the bottom. It's actually a pretty elegant design because this screw does three things at once. It fixes the vise to the workbench, it locks the rotation, and when screwed into the vise, it also engages in this hole in the nut and fixes that in place. So you can basically take the entire vise apart by only removing this one screw and the nut that sits on the spindle. Using a normal screwdriver to get the jaws off was, of course, a bit optimistic, but the impact driver did a pretty good job. I did mangle up some of the screws a little bit in the process, but I'm going to fix those up later. Before you freak out, these jaws are fully hardened, so the hammer doesn't even leave a mark. Surprisingly, the screws on the other jaw came out without any effort. And I also noticed some previous owner must have placed the shim in here for some reason. Not sure why though, because it went together without that just fine. So here's everything disassembled, and I'm going to start with the smaller parts first and do the castings last. I want to start with the spindle and the handle here, and the ends on these handles are usually forged or pressed on there, so there's usually no non-destructive way to remove the handle. One side is actually already loose, and I thought about trying to press this out, but eventually decided on a different approach. It might seem like a sin to some, but I'm just gonna cut off the other side on the bandsaw and turn that into a removable part, so it can be assembled and disassembled in the future. And for the loose end, I'm just going to weld this to make it solid. It doesn't look too pretty right now, but I'm gonna clean this up on the lathe next. By the way, even though this might look very elaborate right now, my goal here isn't to remove every imperfection and every sign of wear, and I'm also not going to polish anything. I like watching my mechanics like most of you, and I appreciate the amount of work that it takes to make something like this look brand new. But besides not having the patience for that, I also actually like that these vises look so rugged and like they've been in use before, so I want to preserve that to some extent. Okay, let's take a look at the spindle next. I'm not sure what kind of steel these parts were made from, but I had a tough time getting a good surface finish on a lot of them, even trying different cutters, so I'm just gonna blame it on the mystery alloy. And now that these are cleaned up, I can easily reassemble the handle thanks to the modified end piece. By the way, the brown belt you see me using here is what I think is called a surface conditioning belt. It's different from a grinding belt in that it only has a very light abrasive effect, so it doesn't really remove much of the base material, but it's great at removing rust and dirt and all kinds of other stuff and just buffing up the surface a little bit. The effect is somewhere between grinding and polishing. Here's a little trick I picked up from watching knife makers. If you have a thin part of metal that's awkward to hold, you can just attach it to a welding magnet and use that as a handle. I couldn't really get this washer to look nice on the grinder, so I made this really quick jig to be able to hold this in the lathe, so I can work on it there. Okay, for the jaws, like I mentioned, these are hardened, so that means grinding is the only way to really work on them. But that's fine, because all I want to do is remove most of the surface rust and sand them flat. I switched to an abrasive belt here with a pretty fine grit, so that I don't accidentally remove too much material and also get a nice finish. There's some slight pitting left from the rust spots, which I could remove by grinding the surface down even lower, but there's a good chance by that point it would get so low that the mounting screws would start sticking out. And like I said, these jaws are hardened, which means I can't just use a drill or countersink on these holes. But like I said, the goal isn't to make everything look brand new. The most important thing is that the rust is gone and they came out nice and flat. So these are just fine. I'd like to take a second for a little announcement here. Don't skip yet, I promise it's not an ad for a smartphone game. I just wanted to let you know that I moved the shirt store over to a new platform, and I also made some new motifs. Most of you probably didn't even know I was offering shirts because I never promoted it much, so now you know. If you like any of these motifs or the content on this channel, getting a shirt is a good way to help me make videos and also get something worthwhile in return. If there's enough interest, I'm also gonna keep making new motifs, so if you have a suggestion, feel free to drop a comment. That's it, so let's continue. Okay, next up is the screw. When I put this in the lathe to clean it up, I noticed there's a pretty significant bend in it, so it wobbles all over the place. It's technically not really an issue, but while I was at it, I decided to try and bend it straight. I'm using the hydraulic press for that, and it can be a little tricky because steel always springs back, so it's easy to overshoot or undershoot the bend, which resulted in a little back and forth. So I didn't get it perfectly straight, but it's a lot better than before now. This looks pretty good now, but there's one little modification I want to make. As you remember, this gets screwed into the vise, and I think the reason that the middle was looking so rough is that there's no way to properly hold this with a hand tool, so previous owners probably just used something like a pipe wrench to grab it, and those always leave a mark. So I'm just going to machine some flat spots on there so that it can be installed properly in the future. The last part beside the main castings is the base plate. I was just going to clean off the old paint and rust at first, but you can probably guess what's coming because I couldn't resist working this on the lathe eventually. I dialed the first surface in as best as possible so that I don't have to remove much material in order to clean this up, because I don't want to change the dimensions too much. And it only took one cut of about 1/10 for this one to clean it up. The outer surface actually has a slight taper to it, so I had to set up my cross slide again. I assume this disc had previously been machined on the top for a clean interface with the vise, but not on the bottom, because that turned out to have some pretty deep pitting. So it's actually not the worst idea to turn this flat, so everything sits nice and flush when you install it. However, I didn't bother doing the inside surface here as well, because it's never going to be seen. Now let's finally move on to the main castings. After removing the rough dirt, I started working on this with different wire wheels and also paint stripping disc. And while this does work pretty well, it's a very tedious and messy process, and due to the shape of this casting, there's also a bunch of spots that are very hard to reach with those methods. This is what they looked like after a few solid hours of grinding, but they're still not as clean as I would like them to be, and faced with the prospect of having to restore an entire second vise, which is even bigger, I thought this might be a good excuse to just get a sandblasting cabinet, so I might have made a bit of an impulse purchase here. After some upgrades to the cabinet, I managed to get this working pretty well, and considering I had already worked these with the wire wheel for hours, it's amazing how much cleaner you can still get them with this method, especially because it gets into all those tiny casting imperfections and hard to reach areas. This is technically not even sandblasting because I'm using tiny glass beads as the blasting medium here. Those are less aggressive than other mediums, so it takes longer, but they leave a really fine and uniform surface. So here's how the castings came out after sandblasting. Perfectly uniform and clean. I'm now cleaning this up a little bit with some files, but like I said earlier, my goal isn't to remove all of the signs of wear or casting marks to make them look spotless. I'm mostly just deburring and chamfering any sharp edges I can find. Since the sandblasting turns every surface rather dull, I'm also buffing up the contacting surfaces. I'm once again using a burnishing disc, which is not to be confused with an abrasive flap disc, which actually takes off material. There's one last thing I want to fix, and that is the anvil on the main casting. It seems like this has seen some serious use in its previous life, so in order to get this flat again, the whole thing is going on the mill. And once again, I even managed to squeeze this on there without having to remove the milling vise. After the first pass, you can see how much this has turned into dish shape. The center here was a good 2 mm lower than the outside. And now for surface finish. If you watched this channel before, you know I'm a fan of cold blue. It's quick to apply, it leaves a nice professional looking finish. and combined with oil it offers some reasonable protection against rust. So for anyone waiting for me to bring out the Hammerite paint, I hate to disappoint you, but I chose to cold blue the castings as well. I'm sure this will be controversial, but I don't really see the point of painting a vise. If you actually use it, the paint gets beaten up quickly anyway, and besides my shop has heat, so rust isn't really an issue. But if I was still in a shop that's cold and damp, I might have just gone for paint. But I was also curious to just find out how this looks, because I've never tried this. On castings, the cold blue tends to leave this yellowish oxidation in all those small holes and pits, but that can be easily removed with something like WD-40, which I'm now applying anyway as an additional protection, and if any rust does show up, I can just repeat that. So I don't know about you, but personally I really like the rugged look of the black castings, and I also like all the signs of this Vise's previous life still being visible. Like I said, I'm gonna restore the second Vise in another video soon, so if you want to see that, consider subscribing, and as always, thanks for watching and see you next time.